Imagine you are standing in a quiet laboratory in Barcelona, Spain, on a winter evening in 1899. The only sounds are the soft scratch of pen on paper and the gentle click of a microscope being adjusted. Santiago Ramon y Cajal sits at his workbench, peering through brass lenses at a thin slice of brain tissue stained with silver nitrate, the delicate specimen mounted on a glass slide that catches the lamplight. Candlelight flickers across his desk, illuminating intricate drawings of neurons, delicate branching cells that look like winter trees against snow, each dendrite and axon traced with patient precision. The smell of chemicals and old books fills the air, the distinctive metallic scent of silver nitrate mixing with the mustiness of leather-bound volumes stacked nearby. Outside, the narrow streets of Barcelona are settling into darkness, the city growing quiet. Inside this modest room, one man traces the architecture of thought itself, cell by cell, sketch by sketch, discovering the individual units that make consciousness possible. His pen moves steadily across paper, translating what his eyes see through the microscope into permanent record, capturing the delicate beauty of neurons that no one before him has truly seen. The patient, quiet work of understanding the brain continues, as it has for decades, as it will for centuries to come. Good evening. Welcome back. If you're new here, welcome. Tonight is a good night to rest. Find a comfortable position wherever you are. Dim the lights if you haven't already, or turn them off completely. Adjust your pillow until it feels just right. Maybe turn on a fan for soft background noise, or simply let the silence settle around you. Let your breathing slow naturally. You're safe here. There's nothing urgent, nothing demanding your attention. Just the slow unfurling of history, told in a way that asks nothing of you except to listen or to drift away, whichever feels right. Tonight, we'll slowly explore the human brain, from ancient anatomical mysteries to the discovery of neurons and synapses, from mapping memory to contemplating consciousness. We'll see how scientists learn to see individual brain cells, trace electrical signals through neural pathways, and begin to understand how 3 pounds of tissue creates thought, emotion, personality, and self-awareness. It's a long journey through centuries of patient investigation, told slowly with many details and atmospheric scenes from different eras. Perfect for drifting off. If this story helps you rest, feel free to like or subscribe. I'm always curious where you're listening from, so if you feel like it, comment your city and what time it is there. But no pressure at all. Just relax and let the story carry you where it will. Now let us return to that moment in Cajal's laboratory, but first, to understand the magnitude of his discovery, to appreciate what it meant to finally see individual neurons, we must step back in time, back to when the brain was complete mystery, when its purpose was debated, when even the most learned scholars could only speculate about this strange organ hidden within the skull. Imagine you are in ancient Egypt, the year being approximately 1500 BCE, standing in a preparation chamber where embalmers work on preserving bodies for the afterlife. The room is dim, lit by oil lamps that cast flickering shadows on whitewashed walls, the air being thick with the smell of natron salt and aromatic resins, myrrh and frankincense masking, but not eliminating the odour of mortality. The embalmers work with practiced efficiency, their hands knowing the routine that will transform a corpse into a mummy that might last millennia. But their treatment of different organs reveals their understanding of importance. The heart is carefully preserved, wrapped in linen, placed back in the body or stored in a canopic jar. The Egyptians believing the heart to be the centre of intelligence, emotion and will, the seat of the soul, what makes a person who they are. The liver, stomach, lungs and intestines are similarly treated with respect, each being essential to life, each deserving preservation for the journey to the afterlife. But the brain, the grey wrinkled organ inside the skull, is considered useless, serving no apparent function, and is therefore extracted through the nostrils with a long hooked instrument and discarded, thrown away as waste. The Egyptians having no concept that this organ they discard is actually the source of everything they attribute to the heart. The embalmer inserts the metal hook into the corpse's nostril, angling it upward into the cranial cavity, using it to break apart the brain tissue, pulling out fragments, the delicate folds and convolutions being destroyed, without understanding, without ceremony, the most complex object in the known universe being treated as garbage, the profound irony being lost on everyone present. The brain is soft, fragile, turning to liquid quickly after death, lacking the obvious mechanical purpose of heart or lungs or stomach, giving no clue through its appearance of the extraordinary function it serves, the consciousness it generates, the memories it stores, the calculations it performs continuously. Time passes. You now find yourself in ancient Greece, perhaps in the 4th century BCE, in a school where philosophers debate the fundamental questions of existence, the nature of thought, the location of the mind. The courtyard is open to sky, columns supporting a covered walkway, students sitting on stone benches, the teacher pacing as he speaks, his words being recorded by scribes who will preserve these arguments for millennia. The debate centres on a question that seems simple but proves profound. Where does thinking happen? Where is the mind located? Some philosophers argue that the brain must be the organ of thought, the reasoning being its position in the head, close to the senses, receiving information from eyes and ears, protected by the hard skull, suggesting importance. Alcmaeon of Croton proposes this in the 5th century BCE, having dissected animals and traced nerves leading from sense organs to brain, the anatomical evidence suggesting connection, suggesting function. But others disagree, most notably Aristotle, perhaps the most influential thinker of the age, who argues that the heart is the seat of intelligence, the brain being merely a cooling organ, a radiator for the blood, serving to temper the heat generated by the heart, preventing overheating of this vital organ. Aristotle's reasoning seems sound from his perspective. The heart is warm, active, clearly essential for life, stopping when life stops, feeling being centred in the chest, where we experience emotions physically, anxiety creating tightness, love creating warmth, the heart being where we feel we live. The brain, by contrast, is cool to the touch, passive, showing no obvious motion, giving no sensation when cut, appearing inert, seeming more like packing material than vital organ. The debate continues for centuries, the question being unresolved, ancient physicians on both sides citing observations and logic, neither having the tools to definitively answer the question, the truth remaining hidden despite the proximity of brain inside every skull. The medieval period brings new investigations, but little progress in understanding function. You find yourself in a European university anatomy theatre in the 15th century, a circular wooden structure built specifically for dissection demonstrations, tiers of benches rising around a central table where a human cadaver lies, the source being typically an executed criminal, the body being used for education before burial, the opportunity being rare, and therefore the attendance being high, medical students and physicians crowding the benches, craning for better views, the atmosphere being serious, reverent despite the macabre subject. The professor of anatomy, dressed in formal academic robes, does not himself perform the dissection, but rather directs an assistant, the barber surgeon, who actually cuts and separates while the professor lectures from a text, typically Galen's ancient writings, pointing with a wooden rod to structures as they are revealed, the demonstration being intended to confirm what the books say rather than discover anything new, the authority of ancient texts being paramount, observation being secondary. The theatre is cold, being winter, the only season when bodies keep long enough for multi-day demonstrations, the smell of decay being managed with aromatic herbs and vinegars, but never fully masked, the audience breathing through cloth held to their noses. When the skull is opened, the saw cutting through bone, creating a sound that echoes in the wooden space, the brain is revealed as grey and white matter, wrinkled like a walnut, the convolutions being noted but not understood, the tissue being soft, fragile, difficult to study. The professor explains the ventricular system, the fluid-filled cavities inside the brain, medieval medicine believing these ventricles to be the seat of mental faculties, different chambers responsible for different functions. The front ventricles for common sense and imagination, the middle for reason and judgment, the rear for memory, the fluid inside being where thinking actually happens, the brain tissue itself being merely the container, serving structural purpose, but not functional. This ventricular theory dominates medieval understanding, seeming to explain how material substance could produce immaterial thought, the fluid being more refined, more spiritual than solid tissue, capable of bridging the gap between body and soul, the ventricles being where the soul might interact with the body, where divine influence might enter, the theory being comfortable, compatible with religious teachings, explaining consciousness without being too mechanical, too materialistic. The brain tissue, the actual neurons and glia that compose it, remains invisible, its purpose remaining unknown, the true architecture of thought being hidden from these careful observers who can see structure but not function. The Renaissance brings more sophisticated anatomy, Leonardo da Vinci making detailed sketches of brain dissections around 1500, his artistic skill capturing the folds and structures with unprecedented accuracy, his drawings showing the ventricles he reveals by injecting wax into the cavities, creating casts of these spaces, his investigations being careful, systematic, scientific, despite the error. Andreas Vesalius publishes De Humani Corporis Fabrica in 1543, containing beautiful anatomical illustrations, correcting many errors from ancient texts, establishing anatomy as based on observation rather than authority, the careful study of actual bodies rather than acceptance of traditional teachings. But even these Renaissance masters, despite their detailed knowledge of brain structure, despite their careful drawings showing every fold and region, cannot explain function, cannot connect the anatomy they document so precisely with the mental phenomena they experience personally, cannot bridge the gap between this organ of meat and the consciousness they know from inside. The fundamental question remains: how does this mass of tissue, weighing roughly 3 pounds in humans, create thought, memory, personality, consciousness itself? The mystery is profound, the explanatory gap being vast, the tools for investigation being insufficient for the task. Centuries pass, anatomy becoming more detailed but function remaining mysterious until the early 19th century brings a new approach. Phrenology, a theory that seems to finally answer the ancient question of how brain structure relates to mental function, though the answer will prove wrong in its details even while being right in its basic insight. You now find yourself in Vienna in 1810, in the office of Franz Joseph Gall, a physician who has developed a revolutionary theory about the brain and behaviour. The room is comfortable, well appointed, bookshelves lining the walls, a large desk covered with papers and anatomical models, and displayed prominently plaster casts of skulls and busts, showing the detailed bumps and depressions of the human head, each one labelled with numbers corresponding to different mental faculties. Gall sits across from a patient, his hands gently palpating the man's skull, fingers reading the contours like a blind person reading Braille, searching for bumps and depressions that will reveal personality and abilities. Gall's theory is called phrenology, from Greek words meaning study of the mind, and it proposes several key ideas. First, that the brain is the organ of the mind, not the heart, settling that ancient debate definitively. Second, that different brain regions control different mental faculties, specialized areas for music, mathematics, language, love, destructiveness, secretiveness, hope, dozens of distinct functions mapped across the brain's surface. Third, that well-developed brain regions are larger and cause bumps in the overlying skull, while underdeveloped regions cause depressions, making personality and ability readable from skull shape. The patient sits still as Gall's fingers move across his scalp, pressing gently, feeling the bone beneath skin and hair, pausing at certain points, making small sounds of interest, occasionally consulting the detailed charts on his walls, showing which bump corresponds to which mental organ. Here, Gall says, pressing behind the patient's ear, the organ of combativeness is quite pronounced, suggesting a strong tendency toward conflict, perhaps making you argumentative. The patient nods, recognizing this in himself, the confirmation seeming to validate the theory, though whether the skull bump came first or the interpretation matched observed behavior is impossible to determine. Gall's office sees a steady stream of clients, people curious about their own faculties, parents wanting their children assessed, employers checking potential employees, the applications of phrenology seeming endless, the theory providing concrete, physical way to understand the intangible mind, giving scientific appearance to questions that previously belonged to philosophy or religion. The examination is comfortable, non-invasive, the palpation being gentle, almost soothing, the results being delivered with authority, grounded in anatomy, in the physical reality of skull shape, in measurements and charts, giving reassuring certainty about mysteries that had never before been penetrable. Though Gall believed skull bumps revealed personality, a theory modern neuroscientists would find charmingly misguided, his core insight proves correct. The brain does indeed have specialized regions, different areas handling different functions. Localization of function being real even if skull shape doesn't reveal it. Phrenology being wrong in method while being right in principle. A pattern common in science where false theories contain seeds of truth that later work can harvest. Phrenology becomes enormously popular through the 1800s, spreading from Vienna across Europe and to America, phrenological societies forming, journals being published, practitioners setting up shops in cities, ceramic busts marked with the locations of mental organs becoming common in homes and offices. The theory being mainstream, respectable, taught in universities, used in criminal justice, employers using it for hiring decisions. The widespread acceptance being testament to its intuitive appeal, to the desire for concrete answers about the mysterious mind, even if those answers are based on flawed premises. The theory eventually falls from scientific favour, careful studies showing no correlation between skull shape and personality, neurological research finding no evidence for the specific mental organs Gall proposed, the bumps and depressions of the skull being determined by bone growth patterns having nothing to do with underlying brain structure, phrenology being revealed as pseudoscience, though its popularity with the public persists into the early 20th century, the intuitive appeal being stronger than scientific refutation, the desire for simple answers about complex questions being powerful, human nature preferring certainty even when wrong to uncertainty that is honest. But phrenology's legacy proves important. It established that brain regions specialize, that different areas do different things, spurring serious scientific investigation of how functions map onto anatomy, how the geography of the brain relates to the geography of the mind, the question being right even if phrenology's answer was wrong, the research program being fruitful even though initiated by flawed theory. The true understanding of the brain begins not with theories of skull shape, but with seeing the brain's actual structure at the cellular level, discovering that this organ, like all organs, is made of individual cells, but cells unlike any others, cells whose shape and function are specifically adapted for communication and computation, cells that we call neurons. You now find yourself in the laboratory of Camillo Golgi in Pavia, Italy in 1873, a modest research space attached to a hospital, the facilities being basic, funding being limited, the work being done out of passion and curiosity more than institutional support. Golgi is experimenting with ways to make brain tissue visible under the microscope. The problem being that brain tissue is nearly transparent, cells being hard to distinguish, their shapes being unclear, attempts to stain whole tissues producing muddy results where everything blends together, the structures remaining hidden despite magnification. Golgi prepares thin slices of brain tissue fixed in chemicals, hardened enough to cut but preserving structure, the slices being perhaps 1/10 of a millimetre thick, thin enough that light can pass through when viewed under a microscope. He treats these slices with silver nitrate, the same chemical used in photography to capture images, hoping it will react with brain tissue in useful ways, make something visible that is currently invisible, reveal the hidden architecture. The result is magical, unexpected, revolutionary. The silver randomly penetrates a small percentage of neurons, perhaps 1 in 100, but those lucky few are stained completely black, including all their branches, the cell bodies and dendrites, and axons being filled with black precipitate, standing out dramatically against the yellow background of unstained tissue, the individual cells being visible for the first time as complete entities rather than fragments or blurs. The view through Golgi's microscope is breathtaking, revelatory, showing cells that look like trees in winter, bare branches against sky, the dendrites reaching out in all directions like roots or branches, the cell body being the trunk, the axon extending away like a main branch, sometimes visible for remarkable distances, the whole cell being captured in the stain, the complex three-dimensional structure being made visible, the individual unit of the nervous system being seen for the first time. Golgi spends hours at his microscope, adjusting focus to trace different branches, seeing how dendrites divide and subdivide, how axons travel through tissue, how different cell types have different shapes, the variety being remarkable, the beauty being unexpected, scientific discovery having aesthetic dimension. The Golgi stain, as it becomes known, revolutionizes neuroscience, allowing detailed study of individual neurons, though Golgi himself interprets what he sees through the lens of the reticular theory, believing that neurons are not separate cells but rather a continuous network. The axons and dendrites fusing together like blood vessels, forming one unified mass, the nervous system being syncytium rather than collection of discrete cells. This interpretation seems reasonable from what Golgi can see, the cells appearing to touch, to merge, the gaps between them being too small to resolve with his microscope, the space being invisible, leading to the natural conclusion that there is no space, that the tissue is continuous. Time passes, the Golgi stain spreading to other laboratories, other researchers seeing these remarkable structures, but the interpretation remains debated, the question being whether neurons are separate or continuous, whether the nervous system is like a highway network with distinct vehicles, or like a river system where everything flows together, the question having profound implications for how information travels, how the brain works, how thoughts and memories and consciousness arise from this tissue. You now return to Barcelona, to Cajal's laboratory, the scene from our opening, but now understanding it better, appreciating what Cajal sees through his microscope. The year is the 1890s, Cajal having learned the Golgi stain technique, spending countless hours applying it to brain tissue from different regions, different ages, different species, being particularly interested in embryonic tissue where neurons are still developing, where their structure might reveal their function, where the architecture might be simpler, more understandable. Cajal's approach is methodical, patient, scientific in the best sense, combining careful observation with detailed drawing, his artistic skill serving his scientific goals, his hand-drawn illustrations capturing not just what he sees, but what it means, highlighting the important features, showing connections and relationships, creating permanent record that others can study, that future generations can learn from. His drawings are beautiful, scientifically accurate, remaining in textbooks over a century later, the gold standard for neuronal illustration. Despite all subsequent technology, his pen and ink recreations somehow capturing more essential truth than later photographs or electron micrographs. What Cajal sees convinces him that Golgi is wrong, that the reticular theory is incorrect, that neurons are individual cells separated by tiny gaps, the stain revealing endings rather than mergers, axons terminating near but not touching other neurons, the gaps being too small for his microscope to fully resolve, but their existence being implied by how the staining stops, how the black precipitate ends rather than continuing into the next cell, the independence being visible to eyes trained to look carefully, to interpret what they're seeing, to think about what the structures mean. Cajal proposes what becomes known as the neuron doctrine. The nervous system is made of individual cells called neurons. These cells communicate across gaps but remain separate. Information flows in one direction through each cell, from dendrites to cell body to axon. Neurons are the structural and functional units of the nervous system. The doctrine seems obvious now, being taught in introductory biology, but at the time it is revolutionary, contested, requiring decades to be universally accepted, the debate between neuron doctrine and reticular theory continuing until electron microscopy in the 1950s finally shows the synaptic gap directly, settling the question definitively. Cajal and Golgi share the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1906, a somewhat awkward pairing given their fundamental disagreement, Golgi using his Nobel lecture to defend the reticular theory, Cajal using his to promote the neuron doctrine, the committee apparently deciding that both had contributed enough to merit recognition regardless of who was right, though history vindicates Cajal, the neuron doctrine being correct, neurons being separate cells, though whether Golgi ever accepted this remains uncertain. His conviction in his own theory being strong, his inability to see what Cajal saw in the same preparations being perhaps intellectual blindness. Confirmation bias making him see fusion where Cajal saw separation. The routine in Cajal's laboratory is repetitive but rewarding, the daily work having its own rhythm, its own satisfaction. Morning begins with preparing tissue samples, taking brain tissue from animals or human surgical or autopsy specimens, fixing the tissue in chemical preservatives, hardening it enough to slice, cutting thin sections with sharp knives, the slicing requiring steady hands, the sections being delicate, easily torn. The Golgi stain is applied, the tissue being immersed in solutions of silver nitrate and other chemicals, the exact recipe and timing being critical, Cajal having refined Golgi's original method, made it more reliable, more likely to reveal beautiful structures. The stained sections are mounted on glass slides covered with thin cover slips, sealed with mounting medium, the slides being stored in wooden boxes, carefully labelled with species, region, age, all the information needed to interpret what they show. The microscope sits on a sturdy bench near the window where natural light is best. Though as evening approaches, lamps are lit, their warm glow supplementing the fading daylight, allowing work to continue, the hours being long, Kajal being consumed by the work, by the endless variety of neurons, by the puzzle of how they connect, how they function, how this collection of individual cells creates the unity of conscious experience. Kajal draws constantly, his pen capturing what he sees, translating the three-dimensional structures visible through varying focus into two-dimensional illustrations, choosing views that reveal important features, sometimes compositing multiple cells to show typical patterns. His drawings being not quite photographs but rather idealized representations, showing the essential features, the characteristic shapes, the meaningful relationships. His notebooks fill with these drawings, page after page of neurons, pyramidal cells from cortex with their characteristic triangular bodies and long apical dendrites, Purkinje cells from cerebellum with their elaborate fan-shaped dendritic trees, spiny stellate cells, basket cells, chandelier cells, dozens of types, each with distinctive morphology, each presumably having distinct function, though function remains mysterious, structure being easier to determine than purpose. The work is solitary often, Cajal spending hours alone with his microscope and drawings, but also collaborative, corresponding with other researchers, sharing preparations, discussing interpretations, the community of neuroscientists being small, most knowing each other. The shared endeavour of understanding the brain, creating bonds despite distances and language barriers, despite competitive priority disputes that sometimes arise, the collective progress being what matters, the individual contributions being stepping stones toward larger understanding. Remember the Egyptian embalmers discarding brain tissue as waste. Now individual neurons emerge from that dismissed organ, each one being revealed as elaborate structure, purpose-built machine. The building blocks of thought being visible, though their precise function remaining unknown, the mechanism of their communication being still mysterious. The question of how neurons communicate, how signals pass from one cell to another across the gaps that Kajal has identified, becomes the next frontier of neuroscience, requiring new tools, new approaches, moving from pure anatomy to physiology, from structure to function, from dead tissue under microscopes to living tissue generating electrical signals. You find yourself in Germany in the 1850s in the laboratory of Hermann von Helmholtz, a brilliant physicist and physiologist who brings quantitative measurement to biological questions, who treats nerves and muscles as physical systems subject to physical laws, whose approach is revolutionary in its rigour. Helmholtz has extracted frog nerve muscle preparations, the sciatic nerve, connecting to leg muscle, keeping the tissue alive in saline solution, the preparation being simple but powerful, allowing direct investigation of how nerve signals work. The preparation sits in a dish, electrodes positioned to stimulate the nerve at one end, other electrodes measuring muscle contraction, the equipment being delicate, the measurements requiring precision, the timing being critical. When Helmholtz stimulates the nerve electrically, a tiny current, the muscle contracts after a delay, the delay being measurable, being the time required for the signal to travel from stimulation point to muscle, Helmholtz having built apparatus capable of measuring intervals of milliseconds, the resolution being unprecedented, the precision being what makes the experiment meaningful. The measurement reveals that nerve conduction is not instantaneous, not infinitely fast as some had thought, but rather travels at measurable speed, roughly 30 meters per second in frog nerves at room temperature, faster in warmer conditions, slower in colder, the speed being mechanical, being limited, being explainable by physical processes rather than mysterious vital forces. The result is profound. Nerve signals are physical phenomena, subject to physical constraints, measurable and potentially understandable through physics and chemistry, not requiring special vitalistic explanation, not being fundamentally different from other natural processes. The mechanism of nerve conduction remains unknown to Helmholtz, the electrical nature being recognized, but the details being unclear. How the signal propagates, why it travels at consistent speed, what physically happens during conduction, all being questions for future research. But the fact that speed is measurable, that nerve function can be quantified, that biology can be studied with physics tools, opens new possibilities, new approaches, new ways of investigating the nervous system. Decades pass, the 20th century arriving, bringing new technologies and new insights into how neurons signal. You now find yourself in 1924 in Jena, Germany, in the laboratory of Hans Berger, a psychiatrist who has spent years trying to record electrical activity from the human brain, believing that mental phenomena must have electrical correlates, that thoughts and feelings must produce measurable signals, that the living brain must generate fields that could be detected, recorded, analysed. Berger has constructed sensitive galvanometers, devices that detect tiny electrical currents, amplifying them enough to move a pen that traces on rolling paper, creating continuous record of voltage changes over time. He places electrodes on his subjects' scalps, large metal discs held in place with straps or paste, the electrodes picking up the summed electrical activity of millions of neurons. The signals being tiny microvolts, requiring careful amplification and filtering to see anything above noise. The equipment being temperamental, the recordings being difficult, many attempts producing only artifacts, only interference. But eventually, after years of trying, Berger succeeds, recording what he calls the electroencephalogram, the electrical writing of the brain, the EEG showing rhythmic waves, patterns of voltage oscillation, the trace being wavy lines on moving paper, the waves having different frequencies, different amplitudes, different patterns depending on the subject's mental state. When the subject is relaxed with eyes closed, the trace shows large, regular waves at about 10 cycles per second, what Berger calls alpha rhythm, the waves being remarkably consistent, beautiful in their regularity. When the subject opens their eyes or performs mental calculations, the alpha rhythm disappears, replaced by smaller, faster waves, beta rhythm, the change being immediate, reproducible, clearly related to mental activity. The EEG is revolutionary, being the first way to observe brain activity non-invasively in living humans, to correlate electrical patterns with mental states, to begin mapping the relationship between neurons firing and consciousness experiencing, though the interpretation is difficult, the signal being very indirect, being the summed activity of millions of cells, the specific sources being unknown, the meanings being unclear. But the patterns are real, reproducible, informative, sleep showing distinctive slow waves, different sleep stages having different EEG signatures, epileptic seizures showing characteristic spike patterns, the technology opening windows into brain function that were previously closed. The laboratory where Berger works is quiet, the equipment being sensitive to electrical interference, the testing being done in shielded rooms, the subjects sitting still, trying not to move, movement creating artifacts, muscle signals being much stronger than brain signals, overwhelming the recording if the subject isn't careful. The room has the atmosphere of careful precision, the equipment being temperamental, requiring constant adjustment, the results being hard-won, Berger spending years perfecting techniques, publishing his first paper in 1929, initially being ignored or dismissed, eventually being recognized as pioneer, his techniques being refined and expanded, becoming standard tools of neurology and neuroscience, the EEG becoming ubiquitous, every hospital having one, every sleep lab using them, the continuous recording of brain waves being routine, though the original difficulty being remembered, Berger's persistence being necessary for the breakthrough. The electrical nature of nerve signals being established by the early 20th century, the next question becomes how these signals are generated, what physically happens when a neuron fires, why neurons produce electrical spikes, how the biology creates the electricity. You find yourself in the 1930s and 1940s in laboratories in England and America where researchers are using sophisticated techniques to record from individual neurons, inserting fine wire or glass electrodes into single cells, measuring the voltage difference between inside and outside, discovering the ionic basis of action potentials, understanding how neurons generate electrical signals through controlled movement of charged particles, sodium and potassium ions, across the cell membrane. The work is technically demanding, the neurons being tiny, the cells being fragile, the electrodes needing to be extremely fine, just sharp enough to penetrate the cell membrane without destroying the cell, the insertion requiring steady hands, patience, luck. When an electrode successfully enters a neuron, the recording shows a resting potential, the inside of the cell being about 70 millivolts negative relative to outside, the voltage being maintained by pumps that actively move ions, keeping sodium low inside and potassium high. The concentration gradients being potential energy stored like a compressed spring, ready to drive electrical signals. When the neuron is stimulated sufficiently, a threshold being reached, the cell membrane suddenly becomes permeable to sodium, the sodium flooding in down its concentration gradient, the inside briefly becoming positive, the voltage swinging from negative 70 to positive 30 in about 1 millisecond. The action potential being rapid, being dramatic. Then potassium channels open, potassium flowing out, the voltage returning to negative, the action potential being complete, lasting just a few milliseconds. The neuron being ready to fire again after brief recovery, the whole cycle being able to repeat hundreds of times per second, neurons being able to signal rapidly, coding information in patterns of spikes, in the timing and frequency of action potentials. The discovery of action potential mechanisms earns Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley the Nobel Prize in 1963. Their mathematical models explaining how sodium and potassium channels create the voltage spike, their equations being beautiful, precise, predictive, capturing the essential physics and chemistry of neuronal signaling, making it comprehensible, making it teachable, the mystery of nerve electricity being largely solved, though many details remaining to be worked out, though the full complexity of ion channels and their regulation requiring decades more research. Remember Kajal seeing neurons separated by gaps? Now the question becomes how signals cross those gaps, how information passes from one cell to another without physical contact, how the electrical spike in one neuron triggers electrical activity in the next, the mechanism of synaptic transmission being the final piece needed to understand basic neural communication. The answer comes from an elegant experiment performed by Otto Loewi in 1921. Though the full story requires decades to unfold, many researchers contributing pieces, the complete picture emerging gradually through patient accumulation of evidence. You find yourself in Loewi's laboratory in Austria, the experiment being performed at night, Lowy having awakened with the idea, rushing to his lab to test it before the inspiration fades. He has 2 frog hearts in dishes, both being kept alive in saline solution, both beating spontaneously as hearts do, the preparations being standard for physiology, allowing controlled investigation without the complications of the whole living animal. One heart still has the vagus nerve attached, the nerve that normally slows heart rate, the other heart being isolated, having no nerves. Lowy stimulates the vagus nerve of the first heart electrically, the stimulation causing the heart to slow as expected, the nerve being inhibitory, the effect being reproducible, being well established. But then Lowy does something novel. He takes fluid from around the stimulated heart and transfers it to the second heart, the heart without any nerves, and remarkably the second heart also slows, the effect being transferred by the fluid, proving that the nerve isn't acting electrically on the heart, but rather releasing a chemical that affects heart rate. The chemical being what Lowy calls vagus stuff, the vagus substance, later being identified as acetylcholine, the first neurotransmitter to be discovered. The experiment is simple, elegant, conclusive, proving that synaptic transmission is chemical, that neurons communicate by releasing molecules that diffuse across the gap and affect the next cell, the mechanism being fundamentally different from electrical propagation along axons, the action potential being electrical, but the signaling between neurons being chemical, the 2 modes being integrated, working together, the system being more complex than simple electrical circuits, but also more flexible, more adaptable, allowing more subtle control. The decades following Lowy's discovery see intensive investigation of synaptic mechanisms, many neurotransmitters being discovered, each having different effects, some being excitatory like glutamate, making neurons more likely to fire, others being inhibitory like GABA, making neurons less likely to fire, the brain using dozens of different chemical messengers, each binding to specific receptors, each having characteristic time course and effect, the chemical complexity being staggering, the possibilities being endless. You find yourself in the 1950s in Bernard Katz's laboratory at University College London, where detailed work on synaptic transmission reveals the quantum nature of neurotransmitter release, the discovery that transmitter is released in fixed packets called quanta, each quantum being one synaptic vesicle, each vesicle containing roughly 5,000 molecules of acetylcholine, the vesicles fusing with the cell membrane and dumping their contents into the synaptic cleft in coordinated fashion when calcium enters the axon terminal triggered by action potential. The laboratory is filled with electrophysiology equipment, amplifiers and oscilloscopes, recording from nerve-muscle junctions the neuromuscular synapse being technically accessible, large enough to study in detail, the same principles applying to brain synapses, though those being smaller, harder to access directly. The recordings show tiny spontaneous potentials, miniature end plate potentials, occurring randomly even without stimulation, each one representing spontaneous fusion of single vesicle, single quantum of neurotransmitter. The baseline release being measurable, being quantifiable. When action potentials stimulate the nerve, the recording shows larger potentials, responses being composed of multiple quanta, the number varying, the statistics revealing that calcium influx triggers probabilistic vesicle fusion, sometimes many vesicles fusing, sometimes few. The variability being built into the mechanism, making synapses tunable, allowing them to be strengthened or weakened, the probability of release being adjustable through various mechanisms, the adjustability being crucial for learning and memory, for plasticity, for the brain's ability to change itself in response to experience. The synaptic cleft, the gap between neurons, is tiny, about 20 nanometers, visible only with electron microscopy. The neurotransmitter molecules diffusing across in less than a millisecond, binding to receptors on the receiving neuron, the receptors being proteins that span the membrane, having binding sites on the outside and channel or signaling machinery on the inside. The binding of neurotransmitter causing conformational changes that open channels or trigger biochemical cascades, translating chemical signal back into electrical or biochemical signals in the receiving cell. The process is rapid, precise, reversible, the neurotransmitter being cleared from the cleft by reuptake or enzymatic breakdown, the synapse being reset for the next signal, the whole cycle being able to repeat hundreds of times per second, fast enough to carry information, slow enough to be controlled. The chemical synapse being one of nature's most elegant solutions to the problem of cell-to-cell communication. The story continues forward, but rest comes easier knowing that the mystery is being solved, that the architecture of thought is being revealed, that neurons and synapses and electrical signals are creating this moment of consciousness, creating your experience of listening, of understanding, of drifting towards sleep, the mechanisms being real, being physical, being understandable, the patient work of neuroscience continuing, the brain studying itself, consciousness contemplating its own basis, the long journey from ancient ignorance to modern insight being ongoing, tomorrow bringing new discoveries, new understanding, but for now, in this quiet moment, the foundations being laid, the essential mechanisms being discovered, the brain revealing itself to those patient enough to look carefully, to measure precisely, to think clearly about this most complex object in the known universe. Decades have passed since those early discoveries of neurons and synapses, since Kajal sketched the branching cells that make thought possible, since Lowy proved that neurons speak to each other in chemical whispers across microscopic gaps. The 20th century brings new questions, new tools, new ways of investigating the brain's relationship to mind, moving beyond individual cells to understand how regions work together, how networks create functions, how the geography of the brain maps onto the geography of consciousness and behaviour. You now find yourself in Paris in the year 1861, in a hospital ward where a patient named Louis-Victor Le Borgne lies in bed, having been admitted many years earlier with epilepsy, but now suffering from additional complications, an infection spreading through his leg, his condition deteriorating. What makes Le Borgne medically interesting is not his current infection, but rather a peculiar deficit he has shown for decades. He can understand speech perfectly, can follow complex instructions, clearly possesses intact intelligence, but cannot speak, cannot produce language beyond a single syllable, tan, which he repeats when trying to communicate, the word giving him his nickname, Tan, the name by which he becomes known in medical history. Paul Broca, a surgeon and anthropologist, examines Le Borgne carefully, documenting his preserved comprehension, his frustrated attempts to express himself, the contrast between intact understanding and destroyed production being stark, being specific, suggesting that language is not a unitary faculty, but rather composed of separable components, that understanding and production might rely on different brain regions, that damage to one could spare the other. Le Borgne dies shortly after, and Broca performs an autopsy, carefully examining the brain, finding a lesion in the left frontal lobe, a region that has been damaged by what appears to be a stroke years earlier, the tissue being soft, discoloured, destroyed in a specific area while surrounding regions appear normal. Broca presents the case to the Société d'Anthropologie in Paris, arguing that language production is localized to the left frontal lobe, that this region, now called Broca's area, is essential for speech, that damage there causes the specific deficit that Le Borgne displayed, the inability to produce fluent speech while comprehension remains intact. The claim is bold, controversial, challenging the prevailing view that mental faculties are distributed across the entire brain rather than localized to specific regions. The debate between localization and distribution being fierce, but Broca accumulates additional cases, more patients with similar damage showing similar deficits, the pattern being consistent, the evidence being compelling. The preserved brain of Le Borgne still exists, stored in a museum, examined occasionally by researchers using modern techniques. MRI scans of the preserved specimen confirming Broca's original description, showing damage to the left inferior frontal gyrus, the region being exactly where Broca identified it over a century ago, his anatomical observation being accurate despite the limited tools available to him, his insight being validated by generations of subsequent research. You find yourself a decade later, in 1874, in Germany, where Karl Wernicke, a physician only 26 years old, describes a different kind of language deficit. His patients can speak fluently, producing words easily, the rhythm and grammar being intact, but their speech makes no sense, being filled with nonsense words, inappropriate word choices, meaningless phrases delivered with normal intonation, the patients being unaware that they are speaking gibberish. More strikingly, these patients cannot understand language, cannot comprehend what others say to them, the comprehension deficit being the opposite of Broca's patients who understand but cannot speak. Wernicke performs autopsies on his patients, finding damage in a different location, the left temporal lobe, posterior and inferior, a region now called Wernicke's area. His insight is that language has multiple components anatomically separated. Broca's area for production, Wernicke's area for comprehension, the two regions being connected by nerve fibers, allowing them to coordinate, to integrate the different aspects of language processing. The model is simple but powerful, explaining different types of aphasia, different patterns of language breakdown, the specific symptoms depending on which region is damaged, which connections are disrupted. The discovery of language areas establishes the principle of localization, proving that complex mental functions map onto specific brain regions, that psychology has neural geography, that the brain is not homogeneous, but rather organized into specialized areas, each contributing particular functions, the whole brain being like a city with different districts serving different purposes, the districts being interconnected but also having distinct characters, distinct roles. Remember phrenology's claim that brain regions specialize? Broca and Wernicke prove this correct, though the regions are identified through careful clinical observation rather than skull bumps, through correlating deficits with lesions rather than measuring bone contours, the scientific method being what transforms speculative phrenology into rigorous neuroscience, observation and correlation being what establishes truth rather than theoretical assertion. Time moves forward. You now find yourself in Montreal, Canada, in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, in the operating room where Wilder Penfield, a neurosurgeon, is performing brain surgery on patients with severe epilepsy, the seizures being so frequent and debilitating that surgery is warranted despite the risks. The goal being to remove the epileptic focus, the region where seizures originate, the damaged tissue that triggers abnormal electrical activity spreading across the brain. The operating room is large, brightly lit by overhead lamps, the patient lying on the table with head immobilized in a metal frame, the skull having been opened, a section of bone removed to expose the brain surface, the dura mater, the tough membrane covering the brain, being cut and reflected, revealing the cortex beneath. Pink-grey tissue, glistening slightly, the surface being marked by convolutions, geary and sulty hills and valleys. The folding being what allows large surface area to fit in limited skull volume. The patient is awake, being conscious during the surgery, this being necessary because Penfield needs the patient's cooperation, needs to know how stimulating different brain regions affects experience, the patient being under local anaesthetic, the scalp and skull being numbed, but the brain itself having no pain receptors, being insensate, electrical stimulation of brain surface causing no discomfort, the patient being able to describe what happens when different areas are activated, providing real-time feedback that guides the surgery, helps identify what regions can be safely removed versus what regions are essential, damage to which would cause unacceptable deficits. Penfield uses a small electrical probe, touching it to different points on the brain surface, delivering brief, mild electrical currents, activating neurons artificially, the stimulation mimicking what would happen if those neurons fired naturally, but under controlled conditions, with the surgeon controlling when and where, the patient reporting what they experience. When Penfield stimulates motor cortex, the patient's hand or foot or face moves involuntarily, the movement being smooth, coordinated, the patient reporting, "My hand is moving," as they watch it happen without willing it. The stimulation directly activating the motor commands that normally come from conscious intention. When Penfield stimulates somatosensory cortex, the adjacent region just posterior to motor cortex, the patient reports sensations, tingling in the fingers, warmth on the cheek, the artificial activation being interpreted by the brain as real sensory input, the patient experiencing phantom touch generated by the surgeon's probe rather than by actual stimulation of the body. The mapping is systematic, adjacent brain regions controlling adjacent body parts, but the proportions are distorted, the hand area being large, the lips being large, the trunk being small, the representation being based on sensitivity and dexterity rather than physical size, the map being what Penfield calls the homunculus, the little man, a distorted human figure that would be proportioned correctly if drawn according to cortical representation rather than body anatomy. The motor homunculus, drawn based on Penfield's mapping, is grotesque and memorable, having huge hands and lips, tiny trunk and legs, the proportions being those of cortical tissue devoted to control rather than physical dimensions, the image becoming iconic in neuroscience, appearing in every textbook, the visual representation of how the brain maps the body, the distortion being meaningful, revealing priorities, revealing what requires fine control, what is most important to survival and interaction. But Penfield's stimulation reveals more than motor and sensory maps. When he stimulates temporal lobe, particularly near the hippocampus, some patients report vivid memories, complete scenes from their past emerging, fully formed, a mother standing in the kitchen, a song playing on the radio, the memory being experienced as if reliving the moment, complete with emotions and details. The patient being surprised by the vividness, by the specificity, memories that haven't been thought about in years, suddenly accessible, seemingly stored in specific neurons, activatable by direct electrical stimulation even when not normally recalled. The memory evocation is controversial, some researchers questioning whether the experiences are true memories or rather confabulations, creative constructions generated by the stimulation rather than retrieval of stored events, the debate being unresolved, but the phenomenon being real, stimulation producing subjective experiences of remembering, proving that memory has neural basis, that past experiences leave physical traces, that brain activity can recreate past consciousness, though exactly how remains mysterious, the mechanisms being still unclear despite the dramatic demonstrations. The surgical environment is calm despite the drama of what's happening, Penfield working methodically, mapping before removing tissue, ensuring that essential functions will be preserved, the assistant surgeon helping, nurses providing instruments, the anesthesiologist monitoring the patient's vital signs. Though the patient is awake, the consciousness making the surgery stranger, more intimate, the patient's verbal responses guiding surgical decisions, the collaboration between surgeon and patient being unique to this procedure, the patient being both subject and collaborator, both passive recipient and active participant. The decades of Penfield's work create detailed maps of cortical function, the motor strip, sensory strip, language areas, all being precisely located, individual variation being noted, but general patterns being consistent, the maps being reliable enough to guide surgery, to predict deficits, to understand symptoms when strokes or tumours damage specific regions, the functional anatomy being established, the geography of the brain being charted with unprecedented precision. Remember Kajal's beautiful drawings of individual neurons? Now Penfield maps how millions of those neurons organise into functional regions, how the cellular architecture supports higher level functions, how the brain's structure enables its capacities, the scales being connected, cellular details relating to regional organisation, relating to behavioural capabilities, the levels of analysis being complementary, each revealing different aspects of how the brain works. You now find yourself contemplating how the brain creates and stores memories, how experience changes neural structure, how learning happens at the level of cells and synapses. The question being fundamental to understanding not just memory, but all brain plasticity, all learning, all development, the question being how the physical brain encodes information, how experiences become represented in neural tissue, how the past persists into the present through changes in cellular connectivity. The theoretical foundation is laid in 1949 by Donald Hebb, a Canadian psychologist, who proposes a simple but profound rule about how synapses might strengthen through use. In his book, The Organization of Behavior, Hebb suggests that when a neuron repeatedly contributes to firing another neuron, the connection between them strengthens, the synapse becoming more effective, future signals being more likely to trigger the target neuron, the principle being captured in the memorable phrase, "Neurons that fire together, wire together." Though Hebb's actual language is more cautious, more qualified, the popular summary being catchier than the original formulation, but capturing the essential idea. Hebb's rule is theoretical, being proposed without direct evidence, being instead inferred from behavioural observations and theoretical reasoning about what mechanisms would be necessary for learning, but the proposal is prescient, being confirmed decades later when technology allows direct measurement of synaptic strength, when researchers can test whether repeated activation actually does strengthen connections, whether Hebb's hypothesis accurately describes the cellular basis of memory. The dramatic illustration of memory's dependence on specific brain structures comes in 1953, though the full implications emerge only gradually over subsequent decades. You find yourself in Hartford, Connecticut, where a 27-year-old patient known as HM undergoes experimental surgery to treat severe epilepsy, the seizures being frequent and debilitating, resisting all medication, the surgery being desperate attempt to provide relief. The neurosurgeon William Scoville removing tissue from both temporal lobes, including most of the hippocampus, bilaterally. The removal being more extensive than originally planned, the consequences being unexpected, being profound. HM wakes from surgery with his seizures dramatically reduced, the surgical goal being achieved, but something else has been lost, something fundamental. HM can remember his childhood, can recall events from years before the surgery, his long-term memories being intact, his personality being preserved, his intelligence being normal. But he cannot form new long-term memories, cannot remember what happened an hour ago, cannot learn new facts, cannot recognize doctors he sees daily, living in an eternal present, the recent past continuously fading, being replaced by confusion, by the disorienting experience of time passing without accumulating, of conversations being forgotten as soon as they end, of every day being new, unfamiliar, disconnected from yesterday. The deficit is specific in revealing ways. HM. The deficit can hold information in short-term memory, can remember a number for a few seconds if he concentrates, can maintain information in consciousness through active rehearsal, but the moment his attention shifts, the information disappears, never being consolidated into long-term storage, never becoming permanent, the transition from temporary to permanent memory being blocked, the hippocampus being revealed as essential for this consolidation process, for transforming experience into lasting memory traces. More remarkably, HM can learn new motor skills, can improve at mirror drawing or other procedural tasks, the learning being demonstrable through improved performance, even though he has no memory of practicing, no recollection of the training sessions, his hands knowing what his mind doesn't remember. Procedural memory being preserved even when declarative memory is lost. The dissociation proving that memory is not unitary, but rather composed of multiple systems, different types of memory depending on different brain structures. Explicit memory requiring hippocampus, while implicit memory, skills and habits, being mediated by different regions, remaining functional when hippocampus is damaged. The study of HM continues for over 50 years, psychologist Brenda Milner and later Suzanne Corkin working with him extensively, publishing hundreds of papers based on his case, HM being perhaps the most studied patient in neuroscience history. His tragedy being transformed into scientific understanding, his loss being humanity's gain in knowledge about memory. Though the ethical complexities remain, the use of a patient's deficit for research raising questions about consent and benefit, questions that the field continues grappling with. HM's real name, Henry Molaison, is revealed only after his death in 2008, his brain being preserved, sectioned into thousands of thin slices, each slice being photographed and digitized, creating complete digital atlas available to researchers worldwide. His brain continuing to teach about memory even after his death, the physical substrate of his unique deficit being available for examination, the anatomy being correlatable with the behavior, the structure explaining the function. The cellular mechanism of memory begins to be understood in the 1970s when researchers discover long-term potentiation, LTP, the phenomenon that Hebb predicted, the strengthening of synapses through repeated activation. You find yourself in a neurophysiology laboratory, electrodes placed in a living brain slice, tissue being kept alive in oxygenated fluid, neurons being functional, synapses being testable. The preparation allowing controlled experiments on mammalian neural tissue, the ex vivo system being intermediate between tissue culture and intact organism, preserving enough complexity to be meaningful while being accessible enough to manipulate and measure. The experiment involves stimulating one pathway repeatedly, delivering electrical pulses in rapid succession, then testing whether the synapse responds more strongly than before stimulation, whether the brief training period has lasting effects. The first clear demonstration comes from Timothy Bliss and Thierry Lomo in 1973, working on hippocampal tissue, the region being chosen partly because of its role in memory, HM's deficit suggesting hippocampus is where memory happens, making it logical place to look for cellular mechanisms. The results are clear. High-frequency stimulation causes lasting increase in synaptic strength, the postsynaptic response being larger after the training, the effect persisting for hours or longer, the synapse being potentiated, the term long-term potentiation being coined to describe this lasting change. The mechanism involves calcium entering the postsynaptic cell, triggering biochemical cascades, activating enzymes, causing insertion of additional receptors into the synapse, changing gene expression, strengthening the connection through multiple mechanisms operating on different timescales. The immediate changes being followed by protein synthesis, dependent consolidation, early LTP being replaced by late LTP, the temporary enhancement being made permanent through structural changes. The discovery of LTP provides the cellular mechanism for Hebb's rule, proves that synapses do strengthen with use, that memories could be stored as changes in connectivity, as patterns of strong and weak synapses, as networks of cells that fire together having wired together. The theoretical proposal being confirmed, the mechanism being revealed, the physical basis of memory being understood at cellular level, though many details remain to be worked out, though the full complexity of memory storage requiring decades more research. The laboratory, where LTP is studied, is filled with electrophysiology equipment, amplifiers and oscilloscopes, computers recording and analyzing data, microscopes for visualizing tissue, micromanipulators for positioning electrodes with micrometer precision, the technical demands being substantial, the experiments requiring skill and patience, the brain slices being fragile, the neurons being temperamental, successful recordings being hard-won, the data being precious, being carefully analysed, being published in papers that advance the field incrementally, the collective progress being built from thousands of careful experiments in dozens of laboratories worldwide, the enterprise being collaborative even when competitive, the shared goal being understanding how the brain works. Time moves forward, technology advancing, allowing researchers to watch the brain work in living humans, to see which regions activate during different tasks, to correlate neural activity with mental states, to begin answering questions that previously belonged to philosophy rather than science. Questions about consciousness, thought, emotion, the subjective aspects of experience being connected to objective patterns of brain activity. You now find yourself in the 1970s as medical imaging begins to revolutionize neuroscience. The first technology is computed tomography, CT scanning, using X-rays to create cross-sectional images of the brain, the machine rotating around the patient's head, taking images from many angles, a computer combining the data to create slices, visualizing brain structure in living patients non-invasively. The innovation being dramatic, earning Godfrey Hounsfield and Alan Cormack the Nobel Prize in 1979. The clinical impact being immediate, strokes and tumours being visible, neurological diagnosis being transformed. The CT scanner is large, the patient lying on a table that slides into a circular opening, the gantry housing the X-ray tube and detectors rotating around the head, the machine making mechanical sounds, clicking and whirring, the scan taking minutes, the patient needing to hold still, movement creating artifacts, blurring the images, the technology being impressive but limited, showing structure but not function, revealing anatomy but not activity. The next step being to develop techniques that show the brain working, that reveal which regions are active during different tasks. Positron emission tomography, PT scanning, emerges in the 1970s and 1980s using radioactive tracers to measure metabolism. The tracers being injected into the bloodstream, accumulating in active brain regions that are consuming glucose and oxygen. The radioactive decay producing positrons that annihilate with electrons, creating gamma rays that are detected by sensors surrounding the head, the computer reconstructing three-dimensional images showing metabolic activity, bright areas being metabolically active, dim areas being quiet, the functional imaging being revolutionary, showing the working brain, correlating activity with tasks, with thoughts, with emotions. The PET scanner room is dominated by the large ring of detectors, the patient's head being positioned at the centre, the radioactive tracer being carefully prepared, the half-life being short, requiring on-site cyclotron to produce the isotopes, the logistics being complex, the cost being high, the research being limited to major centres, but the scientific value being enormous, the ability to see the brain working being unprecedented, the questions being limited only by imagination and experimental design. The true revolution comes in the 1990s with functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, the technique that dominates modern cognitive neuroscience. The technology being based on magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, which uses strong magnetic fields and radio waves to create detailed anatomical images, but fMRI goes further, detecting blood flow changes, using blood oxygenation level dependent signal, BOLD, contrast, to infer neural activity. Imagine you are lying in an fMRI scanner in the late 1990s or early 2000s, participating in a cognitive neuroscience experiment, the scanner being a narrow tube, the bore being about 60 centimeters in diameter, confining, the space being limited, some people finding it claustrophobic, the walls being close, but you are comfortable, wearing headphones to protect your hearing and to receive instructions, lying still on the padded table that slides into the scanner, your head being immobilized with cushions to prevent movement, even small movements creating artifacts, blurring the data. The scanner makes loud hammering sounds when acquiring images, the gradient coils being switched rapidly, creating acoustic noise, the sound being rhythmic, repetitive, the frequency depending on the imaging sequence, the headphones attenuating but not eliminating the noise, the hammering being constant throughout the scan, becoming background, your mind filtering it out as you focus on the experimental tasks being presented through the headphones and through a mirror showing a screen behind the scanner. The experiment might involve simple tasks, viewing faces versus houses, the screen showing photographs, your brain responding differently to each category, fusiform face area, activating strongly to faces, parahippocampal place area, activating to scenes and buildings. The selectivity being remarkable, specific regions caring about specific types of visual information, the specialization being clear in the fMRI data. The coloured blobs on brain maps showing where activity increases for faces versus places, the functional organisation being revealed. Or the task might be remembering words, encoding them during the scan, later being tested on recognition, the hippocampus activating during successful encoding, the activity predicting whether items will be remembered later. The subsequent memory effect being one of fMRI's most robust findings. The difference between remembered and forgotten items being visible in the scanner data, the brain activity during learning determining whether information becomes permanent, the encoding process being observable, the formation of memory traces being catchable in the act. Or the experiment might involve emotions showing frightening images, the amygdala activating in response to threats, fear conditioning being visible as the amygdala learns associations between neutral cues and negative outcomes, the emotional learning being tracked, the neural basis of fear being mapped, the animal work on fear conditioning being confirmed in humans, the same structures being involved, the same principles applying, the evolutionary conservation being evident. The same principles The fMRI data is complex, requiring sophisticated analysis, the signal being noisy, the bold response being delayed by several seconds after neural activity, being sluggish, being indirect, measuring blood flow rather than neural firing, the interpretation requiring careful statistical analysis, comparing active and control conditions, correcting for multiple comparisons across thousands of brain voxels, the analysis being as important as the data collection, the statistical methods being constantly refined, the field being methodologically sophisticated, the standards being high, though concerns about replication and validity continue, the appropriate skepticism being healthy, keeping the field honest. Remember Kajal sketching dead neurons? Now, fMRI watches living neural populations, sees them activate during thought, during memory, during perception, the brain observing itself, consciousness being correlated with neural activity. The subjective being connected to the objective, the first-person experience being related to third-person measurements. The explanatory gap being narrowed, though not eliminated, the mystery being reduced, though not solved. You now contemplate the chemistry of thought, the neurotransmitter systems that modulate brain activity, that influence mood and attention and motivation, that are targets of psychiatric medications, that can be altered to change subjective experience, proving that mind has molecular basis, that consciousness has chemistry, that tweaking neurotransmitter levels tweaks mental states. The neurotransmitters are diverse, dozens being known, each having characteristic distribution, characteristic receptors, characteristic effects. Dopamine is involved in reward and motivation, the mesolimbic dopamine system being activated by pleasurable experiences, by food and sex and drugs, by unexpected rewards, the release of dopamine creating the sensation of wanting, of craving, of motivation to pursue goals, the system being what addiction hijacks. Drugs of abuse causing massive dopamine release, creating artificial reward signals that overwhelm natural ones. The motivation system being corrupted, compulsive drug-seeking behavior being driven by dysregulated dopamine. Serotonin modulates mood and anxiety, the serotonergic neurons being located in the Rafe nuclei of the brainstem, projecting widely throughout the brain, influencing many regions, many functions, the widespread innovation making serotonin a general modulator, a system that adjusts overall brain state rather than transmitting specific information. Low serotonin is associated with depression, with anxiety, though the relationship is more complex than simple deficiency. The chemical imbalance theory being oversimplified, being marketing more than science, but serotonin clearly being important, medications that increase serotonin. Being effective for many patients with depression and anxiety, the therapeutic benefit being real even if the mechanism is not fully understood. The development of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, in the 1980s and 1990s transforms psychiatry. The medications including fluoxetine, Prozac, sertraline, Zoloft, paroxetine, Paxil, becoming some of the most prescribed drugs in the world, millions of people taking them for depression, anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, the medications being relatively safe, side effects being manageable for most people, the therapeutic benefit being substantial for many, though not all patients, the response being variable, some people responding dramatically, others showing no benefit, the individual differences being substantial, the reasons being unclear, highlighting that depression is not one disorder, but rather a syndrome with multiple causes, multiple mechanisms, requiring personalized treatment rather than one-size-fits-all approach. The mechanism of SSR is to block the serotonin transporter, the protein that pumps serotonin back into the presynaptic neuron after it has been released into the synapse, the blockade causing serotonin to remain in the synapse longer, increasing the activation of serotonin receptors, enhancing serotonergic transmission, the effect being rapid, occurring within hours, but the therapeutic benefit being delayed, typically requiring several weeks of treatment before mood improves. The delay suggesting that the mechanism is not simple neurotransmitter level increase, but rather downstream adaptive changes, receptor regulation, gene expression changes, neuroplasticity. The antidepressant effect being indirect, requiring the brain to adjust to altered neurotransmitter levels, to rewire itself in response to the drug. The time course being frustrating for patients, but being biological reality, reflecting the complexity of mood regulation. Other neurotransmitters play different roles. Norepinephrine in alertness and attention, GABA being the main inhibitory transmitter, glutamate being the main excitatory transmitter, acetylcholine in learning and arousal, the chemical diversity being staggering, each transmitter having multiple receptor subtypes, each receptor subtype having distinct distribution, distinct functions, the pharmacology being complex, the opportunities for therapeutic intervention being numerous, drugs targeting specific receptors being developed for various conditions, the precision being increased, the side effects being reduced, the medications being refined through decades of research, though many psychiatric medications still being relatively crude, affecting multiple systems, causing significant side effects. The need for better treatments being clear, the ongoing research being motivated by desire to help people suffering from mental illness, to relieve symptoms that can be debilitating, life-destroying, the medications being imperfect but being better than nothing, being real help for real suffering. The story continues forward, the mechanisms becoming clearer, the mysteries becoming smaller, though never disappearing. But rest comes easier knowing that the brain is knowable, that consciousness has neural correlates, that thought has physical basis, that the patient work of neuroscience is revealing how you work, how this moment is being created by 86 billion neurons firing in patterns, creating experience, creating awareness, the machinery being real, being physical, being inside your skull, working constantly, creating this very moment of reading, of understanding, of gradually drifting towards sleep as your brain prepares for the nightly restoration, the memory consolidation, the dream generation, the cycling through consciousness that happens every night. The brain knowing what to do, requiring no conscious control, the transition being natural, being automatic, being approaching now as the story continues, as the mechanisms become familiar, as the technical details fade into atmospheric background, as the hum of the scanner and the scratch of Kajal's pen and the quiet click of Penfield's probe merge into the gentle rhythm of falling asleep. Time moves forward into the present era, into the questions that remain despite centuries of patient investigation, despite all the neurons sketched and synapses measured and brain regions mapped. The deepest mystery persists. How does the physical brain create subjective experience? How do electrical signals and chemical transmitters produce the feeling of being, the sensation of consciousness, the internal theatre where thoughts and emotions and perceptions play out, the what it's like to be you, to see red, to feel pain, to know that you exist and are aware? You now find yourself contemplating what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, the explanatory gap between objective neural activity and subjective experience. The question being why brain processes feel like something, why there is something it is like to be a conscious being rather than just information processing happening in darkness, unconsciously, zombie-like. The problem is hard not because we lack data, but because we lack even a theory, of how physical processes could produce phenomenal experience, how matter could generate mind, how the neurons whose mechanisms we understand in such detail could collectively create the unified field of awareness that you experience in this moment. Different theories attempt to bridge this gap, to explain consciousness in terms of brain processes, though whether any succeed remains debated, the field being characterized more by theoretical proposals than by consensus, more by questions than by answers. Global workspace theory, proposed by Bernard Baars, suggests that consciousness arises when information is broadcast widely across the brain, becoming available to many cognitive processes simultaneously, the workspace being like a theatre stage where information enters awareness by being spotlit, made globally available, integrated with other information. The theory explaining how some brain processes are conscious while others remain unconscious, the difference being global accessibility rather than local processing. The difference being integrated information theory developed by Giulio Tononi proposes that consciousness corresponds to the amount of integrated information in a system. The more a system integrates information across its components while maintaining differentiation, the more conscious it is, the theory being mathematically formalized, yielding a measure called phi that supposedly quantifies consciousness. Though whether phi really measures experience or just complex integration remains debated, the theory being ambitious, attempting to explain not just human consciousness, but also the possibility of consciousness in other systems, whether animals, infants, or even sophisticated I might have varying degrees of consciousness depending on their phi values. Predictive processing theories suggest the brain is constantly generating predictions about sensory input, comparing predictions with actual input, using the prediction errors to update its internal model, consciousness being this generative model, the brain creating reality rather than passively receiving it, the subjective experience being the brain's best guess about what's happening rather than direct perception of the external world, the theory explaining illusions, hallucinations, dreams, as cases where the generative model runs with minimal or absent sensory input, the internal simulation becoming untethered from reality. You find yourself in a modern consciousness research laboratory, perhaps in the 2000s or 2000s, where these theories are being tested empirically, the philosophy being connected to neuroscience through careful experiments, the subjective being approached through objective measurements. Though the fundamental explanatory gap remains, the data being compatible with multiple theories, the decisive experiment being elusive. The laboratory has standard neuroscience equipment, fMRI scanners, EEG monitors, but also specialized setups for particular paradigms. Binocular rivalry displays where different images are shown to each eye, the perception alternating between them even though input is constant, the neural correlates of consciousness being identified as the activity that correlates with which image is currently perceived, rather than which is currently presented. The researchers study patients emerging from coma, tracking the recovery of consciousness, identifying which brain activity patterns predict recovery versus vegetative states. The clinical applications being important, the theoretical implications being profound, consciousness being something that can be absent then present, that comes in degrees, that can be disrupted by anesthesia or sleep or brain damage, the fragility being sobering, the dependence on brain function being undeniable, even as the mechanism remains mysterious. Split brain patients provide unique insights, these being people who have had their corpus callosum severed to treat epilepsy, the massive bundle of nerve fibres connecting left and right hemispheres being cut, preventing seizures from spreading but also disconnecting the hemispheres, creating in effect two separate conscious systems in one skull. each hemisphere being able to process information independently, sometimes having different preferences, different knowledge. The question being whether there are now two consciousnesses or still one, whether each hemisphere has its own experience, or whether unity is maintained through some other route, the philosophical puzzles being as interesting as the neuroscience. The question of consciousness extends to other species, to animals whose brains are structured differently, but who clearly have experiences, who show pain and pleasure and fear and curiosity, whose subjective lives seem real even if different from human consciousness. The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, signed by prominent neuroscientists in 2012, affirms that many animals possess the neurological substrates of consciousness, that consciousness is not uniquely human, but rather exists across species, though the specific character of animal consciousness remaining unknown, what it's like to be a bat or an octopus or a bee being experientially inaccessible, though their neural responses suggesting that it's like something, that they're not mere automatons but beings with inner lives. Whether consciousness will ever be fully explained remains uncertain among researchers and philosophers, some being confident that neuroscience will eventually close the explanatory gap, will explain consciousness in neural terms, will make subjective experience comprehensible through objective mechanisms, while others doubt that consciousness can ever be fully reduced to brain processes, that the first-person perspective has an irreducible character, that what it's like to see red cannot be captured in third-person descriptions of neurons firing, the debate being unlikely to be resolved soon, the hard problem living up to its name. Remember ancient Egyptians discarding brains as useless? Now we know consciousness requires brain, that damage disrupts experience, that anesthesia can turn consciousness off and on like a switch, proving the dependence even as the mechanism remains mysterious, the correlation being undeniable even as causation remains puzzling. You now turn your attention to sleep, to the nightly dissolution and reconstitution of consciousness, to the cycling through stages that everyone experiences, to the dreams that occupy roughly 2 hours each night, to the essential restoration that sleep provides, to the mysteries that persist despite decades of sleep research, despite detailed knowledge of sleep stages and EEG patterns and hormonal changes. The modern understanding of sleep begins in the 1950s, when researchers discover REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, the stage characterized by eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids, brain activity resembling waking patterns, muscles being paralyzed except for breathing and eye movements. The discovery being made by Eugene Aserinsky and Nathaniel Kleitman at the University of Chicago, using early EEG equipment to monitor sleeping subjects, noticing periodic episodes of activation, investigating further, discovering that waking subjects during these episodes almost always produces dream reports, proving that REM sleep is when dreaming primarily occurs. You find yourself in a sleep research laboratory in the present day, perhaps visiting a university sleep center or a hospital sleep clinic, the facility being designed for overnight studies, having bedrooms that look relatively normal but are filled with monitoring equipment, cameras recording from infrared light, microphones capturing sounds, and most importantly, polysomnography equipment recording brain waves, eye movements, muscle tone, heart rate, breathing, the comprehensive monitoring revealing sleep's complexity, its multi-organ nature, its carefully orchestrated cycles. The bedroom is comfortable, the bed being standard, though the sleeper wears a cap covered with electrodes, EEG sensors positioned according to the International 10 to 20 system, covering the scalp connected by wires to amplifiers in the adjacent control room, the wires being long enough to allow natural movement, but being visible reminder that this is not entirely natural sleep, that the sleeper is being observed, measured, studied. The room is dark, curtains blocking external light, temperature being controlled, distractions being minimized, the environment being optimized for sleep, though some subjects find the monitoring disruptive initially, adjusting after a night or two, eventually sleeping normally despite the electrodes and cameras. In the control room, technicians monitor screens showing the ongoing EEG traces, the multiple channels showing activity from different scalp locations, the patterns changing as sleep deepens, the progression through stages being visible in real time. Sleep begins with stage 1, light sleep. The transition from wakefulness being gradual, alpha rhythms fading, theta rhythms emerging, the eyes moving slowly, muscles relaxing, consciousness dimming, the sleeper being easily aroused, often not recognizing they were asleep if awakened, the boundary between wake and sleep being fuzzy, the transition being continuous rather than discrete. Stage 2 brings sleep spindles and K complexes, characteristic EEG patterns, the spindles being brief bursts of rhythmic activity at 12 to 14 Hz. The K complexes being large, sharp waves, both being generated by thalamus, the patterns being markers of consolidated sleep, the sleeper being harder to arouse, clearly asleep rather than drowsy, though still relatively light, still responsive to loud sounds or strong stimuli, the sleep being real but not yet deep. Stage 3, deep sleep or slow wave sleep, shows large, slow delta waves, 0.5 to 2 Hz oscillations dominating the EEG, the brain being synchronized, vast populations of neurons firing together in slow rhythm, the sleep being profound, the sleeper being difficult to arouse, waking being disoriented, confused, the depth being obvious in behavior and physiology, growth hormone being released, memories being consolidated, the brain performing essential maintenance that cannot happen during wakefulness, the necessity being proven by sleep deprivation studies showing that missing deep sleep impairs memory, immune function, emotional regulation, the restorative nature being undeniable. After roughly 90 minutes of progressing through these NREM stages, the sleeper enters REM sleep, the EEG suddenly resembling waking patterns, beta and theta waves replacing delta waves, the eyes moving rapidly behind closed lids, the muscles being completely paralyzed except for breathing and eye movements. The paradox being that the brain is highly active while the body is paralyzed, the paralysis being protective, preventing the sleeper from acting out dreams, the paralysis sometimes failing, causing REM sleep behavior disorder, where people physically enact dreams, sometimes injuring themselves or bed partners. The disorder revealing that dreams involve motor planning, that the brain is trying to move, the paralysis being what normally prevents actual movement. Dreams during REM sleep are vivid, bizarre, emotional, the brain generating narratives without external input, creating characters and places and events that seem real while dreaming, the logic being absent but not noticed. Impossible transitions being accepted, the dream being experienced as reality until waking reveals it wasn't. The ease of deception being humbling, proving that subjective experience is brain-generated rather than directly perceived. That consciousness is simulation that usually matches reality but can run independently during sleep. The function of REM sleep and dreaming remains debated. The theories including memory consolidation, emotional processing, threat simulation, random activation with meaning being imposed after waking, the evidence being mixed, supporting multiple theories, the true function possibly being multifaceted, serving several purposes simultaneously or possibly being epiphenomenal, being byproduct rather than adaptation. The dreams being what happens when the brain is active but disconnected from sensory input, meaningful subjectively but not necessarily functional evolutionarily. The sleep cycle repeats 4 to 5 times per night, the proportion of REM increasing in later cycles, deep sleep being concentrated in early night, the architecture being carefully regulated, the timing being controlled by circadian rhythms, and homeostatic sleep pressure. The two-process model explaining sleepiness as combination of time since waking and circadian phase, the biological clock being located in suprachiasmatic nucleus of hypothalamus, receiving input from eyes, entraining to light-dark cycle, generating roughly 24-hour rhythm of alertness and sleepiness, the rhythm being endogenous, persisting even in constant conditions, though being adjustable by light exposure, allowing adaptation to different time zones or work schedules, though adjustment being slow, requiring several days to shift fully. Jet lag being consequence of mismatch between internal clock and external environment. The essential nature of sleep being proven by deprivation studies, both total sleep deprivation and selective REM, or slow-wave deprivation, showing impairments in cognition, memory, emotion, immune function, the effects being cumulative, chronic sleep restriction being as harmful as acute total deprivation. The modern epidemic of insufficient sleep being public health concern, the typical adult needing 7 to 9 hours, many getting less, the consequences being subtle but real, the sleep debt accumulating, affecting health and performance, the importance being underappreciated in culture that often values productivity over rest, that treats sleep as luxury rather than necessity, the biological reality being that sleep is non-negotiable, that consciousness requires daily renewal, that the brain needs offline time to maintain itself. Remember Kajal sketching neurons in candlelight? Now sleep researchers watch those neurons cycle through activity patterns, see them consolidate memories, observe the glymphatic system flushing metabolic waste from brain during sleep, the cleaning happening primarily during deep sleep when neurons are synchronized, the interstitial space expanding, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to flow through, carrying away accumulated proteins and toxins, the maintenance being essential, possibly explaining why sleep deprivation is ultimately fatal, the brain needing regular cleaning to function long term. You now find yourself in cutting-edge neuroscience laboratories of the 2000s, 2010s, and 2020s, where new technologies allow unprecedented control and observation of neural activity, where researchers can turn specific neurons on or off with light, can watch thousands of neurons simultaneously in living brains, can trace every connection in small nervous systems, can begin to assemble complete wiring diagrams, the tools being revolutionary, the progress being rapid, though the brain's complexity remaining daunting, the full understanding remaining distant. Optogenetics, developed in the mid-2000s by Carl Deiseroth and colleagues at Stanford, combines genetics and optics to control neurons with light, the technique involving inserting genes for light-sensitive proteins, channel rhodopsins, into specific neuron types, the proteins being ion channels that open when illuminated with blue light, causing the neurons to fire, the control being precise, millisecond timing, specific cell types, causal testing of what neurons do, not just correlation, but intervention, the ability being transformative for neuroscience. The laboratory using optogenetics is sophisticated, requiring viral vectors to deliver genes, surgical procedures to implant optical fibers into brain, light sources, and control electronics, behavioral testing to assess effects of stimulating or inhibiting specific circuits, the experiments revealing what neurons do by testing what happens when they're activated or silenced, the causal chain being established, the functions being assigned to circuits rather than just correlating activity with behavior, the progress being substantial, particularly in animal models, understanding of fear, reward, movement, all being advanced through optogenetic manipulation. Connectomics attempts to map every neuron and synapse to create complete wiring diagram. The goal being understanding brain architecture at ultimate resolution, knowing exactly what connects to what. The project being analogous to Human Genome Project, but vastly more complex, the human brain having roughly 86 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses. The complete human connectome being currently infeasible, but progress being made on smaller systems, the nematode worm C. Elegans having 302 neurons fully mapped in 1986, fruit fly brain being partially mapped, mouse cortex being actively worked on, the techniques involving electron microscopy of brain sections, computational reconstruction of cells from image stacks, the automation being necessary, human annotation being impossible at required scale, machine learning being essential for processing petabytes of image data. Two-photon microscopy allows imaging deep into living brain tissue, the technique using infrared light that penetrates deeper than visible light, exciting fluorescent proteins in neurons, the imaging being combined with calcium indicators, proteins that fluoresce more strongly when calcium increases, calcium being proxy for neural activity. The combination allowing researchers to watch populations of neurons firing in living animals, seeing hundreds or thousands of cells simultaneously, observing how populations encode information, how activity patterns relate to behavior. The technology being particularly powerful for studying sensory processing, watching visual cortex respond to images, auditory cortex respond to sounds, the neural code being partially deciphered, though fully understanding population coding remaining challenge. You find yourself considering brain-computer interfaces, technologies that connect brain directly to external devices, allowing paralyzed patients to control robotic arms with thought, cochlear implants restoring hearing by directly stimulating auditory nerve, retinal implants providing crude vision by stimulating remaining retinal cells, the interfaces being bidirectional, reading neural activity and writing sensory information, the applications being primarily medical currently, restoring lost function, but the technology raising possibility of enhancement, of augmenting normal brain function, of humans merging with machines. The science fiction becoming science fact, though current interfaces being crude, requiring extensive training, providing limited bandwidth, the future possibilities being speculative, uncertain, the ethical questions multiply as capabilities increase, whether cognitive enhancement through drugs or stimulation is cheating or personal freedom, whether memory enhancement would change identity, whether uploading consciousness to computers is theoretically possible, whether that would preserve identity or create copy, whether AI could be conscious, whether creating conscious AI would be ethical, the questions being profound, the answers being unclear, the technology advancing faster than ethical frameworks, the discussions being necessary, urgent, difficult. Whether we will enhance memory, intelligence, mood beyond normal remains uncertain, the technologies existing but being primitive, transcranial magnetic stimulation showing modest effects, nootropics being controversial, genetic enhancement being theoretically possible but ethically fraught, the desire to improve ourselves being eternal, the means being increasingly available, the wisdom to use them appropriately being questionable, the future being shaped by choices being made now, by which technologies are developed and deployed, by what regulations are imposed, by what values guide application of neuroscience to human enhancement. It is late now, very late, the hour being past midnight, the day ending, sleep approaching. The story has travelled far, from ancient mysteries to molecular mechanisms, from discarded brains to mapped circuits, from philosophical speculation to scientific measurement, from ignorance to insight, though mysteries remain, though consciousness persists in being puzzling, though the brain continues revealing itself slowly, patiently, through the accumulated work of thousands of researchers across centuries. You stand now in a quiet sleep research laboratory after midnight, the facility being part of a university neuroscience department, the building being mostly empty, the hallways being dark, only exit signs and security lights illuminating the corridors. You enter the control room adjacent to the sleep chambers, the room being small, dominated by computer monitors showing ongoing polysomnography recordings, the multiple screens displaying EEG traces, eye movement channels, EMG showing muscle tone, respiratory monitors, the data flowing continuously, being recorded automatically, requiring minimal supervision, though a technician remains present, monitoring for problems, ensuring equipment functions correctly. The monitoring room is dark except for screen glow, the blue-white light from monitors being the only illumination, casting the technician's face in pale light as they watch the traces, occasionally making notes, mostly just observing, ensuring the night passes smoothly for the sleeping subjects in adjacent rooms. The hum of computers is quiet but constant, fans cooling processors, hard drives recording data, the mechanical sounds being soothing white noise, the steady operation being reassuring, the equipment being reliable, the technology serving the research unobtrusively. On the monitors, EEG traces show one subject in deep sleep. Stage 3, large, slow delta waves rolling across channels, the synchrony being visible, all regions showing similar patterns. The brain being globally coordinated in this state, the slow oscillations being beautiful in their regularity, in their power, the large amplitude indicating millions of neurons firing together, the rhythm being approximately 1 cycle per second. Slow like ocean swells. Like breathing, the pattern being hypnotic to watch, the traces scrolling steadily across screens, the endless waves continuing, the sleep being profound, restorative. Another monitor shows a different subject entering REM sleep, the transition being dramatic, the EEG suddenly desynchronizing, the large, slow waves being replaced by faster, lower amplitude activity, resembling waking patterns, the eyes beginning to move, the EOG channels showing rapid deflections, left and right eyes moving, in coordinated patterns scanning the dream landscape, seeing images that don't exist outside the brain, the motor cortex being active, planning movements that the body doesn't execute, the paralysis being visible in the EMG showing zero muscle tone except for breathing which continues steadily. The dissociation between brain activity and body state being the hallmark of REM sleep, the paradox being visible in the data. The sleeping subject is dreaming, experiencing a narrative, perhaps running from danger or flying or having conversation, the content being unknowable from EEG patterns, the brain activity showing that something is happening but not what, the subjective experience being private, accessible only through waking reports, the dreams being the most intimate demonstration of consciousness, being brain-generated, being internal simulation that feels real while experienced, only recognized as illusion upon waking, the nightly proof that subjective reality is constructed, that your experience of this moment is also constructed, also brain-generated, also dependent on these same neurons that are now creating dreams in sleeping subjects. The room is quiet, the technician occasionally checking other monitors, verifying recording quality, the night shift being peaceful, the work being routine, watching people sleep being simultaneously boring and profound, the subjects being unaware of being observed, their consciousness cycling through stages, memories being consolidated, synapses being modified, the brain doing essential work during this offline time, the restoration being necessary for tomorrow's waking, for consciousness to function properly, for the daily renewal that sleep provides. Somewhere in these sleeping brains, neurons are firing in patterns that will strengthen synapses containing today's experiences, that will weaken unused connections, that will integrate new memories with old knowledge, that will prepare neural networks for tomorrow's challenges, the plasticity being ongoing, the brain being never static, always adapting, always changing, the physical structure being modified by experience, by practice, by sleep itself, the learning being embodied, being literally physical, being changes in connectivity, in synaptic strength, in neural architecture. Remember those Florentine counting houses where Medici clerks balanced ledgers? Remember Cajal sketching neurons by candlelight? Remember Penfield stimulating cortex during surgery? Remember HM living in eternal present? Remember fMRI watching hippocampus encode memories? The long journey from mystery to mechanism continues, each discovery building on previous work, each generation of researchers advancing understanding, the patient accumulation of knowledge spanning centuries, involving millions of observations, experiments, measurements, the collective enterprise being humanity's attempt to understand itself. Consciousness, studying consciousness, the brain investigating its own basis, the strange loop being inherent, unavoidable, fascinating, the strange loop. Somewhere tonight, your own brain is preparing for sleep, perhaps already beginning the transition, neurons slowing their firing, thalamus gating sensory input, consciousness dimming, the familiar process beginning, happening without conscious control, your brain knowing what to do, having done it every night of your life, the routine being automatic, being reliable, being approaching now. The story ends here, in this quiet monitoring room, watching brain waves scroll across screens, consciousness cycling through its nightly dissolution and reconstitution, the mystery being reduced but not eliminated, the mechanisms being understood but wonder remaining, the brain being knowable but never fully known, the patient work continuing, tomorrow bringing new questions, new techniques, new insights, but for now, in this peaceful hour, the work being done, the story being told, rest being earned, sleep being welcome. Let those neurons slow their firing, let consciousness gently dissolve. Let the brain do what it does every night, consolidating memories, clearing metabolic waste, cycling through stages, generating dreams that will evaporate on waking. Trust the process. Trust the 86 billion neurons that create every moment of your experience. Trust that they know how to guide you into sleep, how to maintain essential functions, how to restore themselves for tomorrow. The mystery continues, inside your skull, behind your closed eyes, creating this fading moment. Rest now. Sleep well. The brain's patient work continues while you dream.